In a world where over 270 million people live amid conflict zones, the ripple effects reach far beyond borders, reshaping economies, energy security, and everyday lives. What do these global tremors mean for Sri Lanka? On Kaleidoscope Ceylinco Life Dialogues today, we are joined by Rehana Thowfeek, co-founder and director, Civic Education at Arutha, to explore how shifting geopolitics intersect with local realities and what lessons we can draw for resilience. Given Sri Lanka's heavy reliance on the Gulf's oil and gas, what contingency strategies do you think are viable if supply disruptions persist the way they are?
So in terms of contingencies, we have already switched and bought oil from different countries like the USA, and India has supplied oil to us as well, and then we are in negotiations with China and Russia. And for gas, our main supplier last year was Oman. They are uniquely not affected by the closure because of their geographic position, but of course prices will rise as shipping and also insurance costs rise as well. Of course, if this persists for many years, then that's a very different situation that we are looking at, and then we're going to have to look at how do we transition our economy to a situation where energy flows are not the same as it is today. So that could mean anything from transitioning our electricity generation to renewable resources like hydro and solar, and also even switching gas consumption away, like for cooking purposes. Instead of using gas, we might have to look at something like induction cooking.
We saw mass repatriations during COVID, and that was from the Middle East, and we have a heavy reliance on remittances. Would we see something similar given what we are seeing right now?
If we look at the remittances we get from the Gulf nations, it accounts for about 38%, which is quite large. And we do rely on worker remittances for our reserve building capabilities, as well as for even to finance our forex needs. Right now there aren't major disruptions in terms of job loss, but there have been reports of job sort of suspensions, and of course this will, if the situation continues or even escalates, there would be there is a necessity to repatriate. And of course, if Gulf, the businesses in the Gulf nation can't operate at the normal capacity that they were, that would of course mean that there will be job losses.
So given our heavy reliance on migrant worker remittances, how can policymakers sort of reshape and prepare for mass repatriations?
If we look at the situation in the previous, how did we, prepare for repatriations? I think we work closely with those nations, the governments, and also international agencies like the International Organization for Migration. And at that point, I think the government also gave quite significant compensation packages for workers. Unfortunately, you'll have to do that if you want to secure their income to a certain extent. Unfortunately, also, I think some of our workers in the Gulf are in somewhat precarious job situations. There isn't real job security or protections. There is a risk for migrant workers, and I think the government will really have to step in to support them to transition.
If shipping routes remain unstable the way they are, what alternative markets or trade corridors do you think we can use?
I think the most affected export is likely to be tea, because about 25% of our tea goes to some of the blockaded Gulf nations, and then about 52% of it goes to the wider West Asian region. So this accounts for about $850 million in revenue. And unfortunately, I think for tea, there don't seem to be alternative markets as it is right now, because black tea faces very stiff competition from countries like Kenya, India, and even China. But I think there may be a market, and there may be a potential to pivot towards more premium products, more value-added products in other sort of regions. But unfortunately, I think given the blockade and there are alternative shipping routes, but whether those are viable in terms of the cost and the time taken and the insurance premiums even, that remains a question. But I think the tea industry is going to face quite a significant setback from this situation.
So let's look at fertilizer, which is tied considerably to the Middle East and suppliers. If there are disruptions, what would that do for our agricultural productivity and our food security?
About 57% of our fertilizer imports last year came from China, but about 22% comes from the West Asian region. So because of that, of course, and China has actually halted exports, of course, to protect their own domestic production and food security. So this does put Sri Lanka at a significantly, there's a high exposure. And we are just starting the Yalla season now. And for planned production, it is estimated that we will need about 200,000 metric tons of fertilizer. But by all accounts, it appears that we only have about 100,000 metric tons of fertilizer. Now, whether that is fertilizer in hand or fertilizer in contracts is also, I personally don't know. And that might mean prioritizing certain crops over others, or prioritizing certain food over, say non-food or even export crops. The government has prioritized paddy cultivation and released sufficient fertilizer stocks for that. So I think in terms of rice production, we should be okay. But we will definitely face price increases because the price of urea, for instance, which is the most widely used fertilizer, has doubled from $380 a ton to $720, I think, last I checked. The government has also increased the fertilizer subsidy that it gives to farmers, and this will, to a certain extent, help to cushion the inflationary impact. But of course, this is also only viable in the short run because it's not fiscally prudent to keep these subsidies going on for a long time, and not possible either. So food security is a major issue, and it's not just a consequence of this war. Actually, if we look at the impacts of the economic crisis, food insecurity increased rapidly, poverty doubled, child malnutrition just reversed gains, and has been increasing and has remained elevated. And the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that about 9 million Sri Lankans can't afford a healthy diet. So in this context, it is a major blow, and I think the government must step in and enact a lot of, there are urgent measures and then more medium to long-term measures that we can do to ensure food security.
So now tourism, already very fragile and the very first industry to react when there is a global problem. How is this conflict or the continuation of the conflict actually going to reshape Sri Lanka's tourism industry?
Air ticket prices have doubled, tripled even because of the jet fuel shortage. And if we take the European tourists who come to Sri Lanka, they use the Gulf nations as transit points. So they're not able to access those, so they're not able to come to Sri Lanka, or they have to use alternate routes, which are also very expensive. And then, of course, if you look at the global, this sort of heightened security risk, the propensity to travel is also quite low because you tend to push it forward. But Sri Lanka tourism itself has been undergoing some changes in dynamics. For instance, the growth of Indian tourists to Sri Lanka, it grew quite rapidly in the last 2 to 3 years. And there have been, for example, there have been a lot of cultural sites that they like to visit. So we pivoted towards, say, the Indian market. So now I think those kinds of changes will continue. Unfortunately, it does look like we have to just be very reactionary at this point. But I think, again, in the long term, there has to be a more sustainable plan. And I think, of course, we can't rely fully on tourism because of how unstable it is. So it is, again, about how do we diversify our economy. Tourism is, of course, very important, but how do we also look at other sectors and make sure that they're all contributing effectively.
So looking at our geographic location, is there any way that we can capitalize, optimize on what we have given the global supply chain routes and the changes that we are seeing?
Our geographic position is something we have sort of relied on in the past, for instance with Colombo Port and its sort of geographic strategic location. But the world has changed significantly since. Even if you take Colombo Port, earlier it was almost unrivaled because of its deep water capabilities. But now with India setting up the Vizhinjam port, for instance, there is a direct threat and competition. So how do we face this? Are we reacting sufficiently? Are we investing sufficiently to face these and to position ourselves as a serious partner when we're doing business? So definitely I think there can be some opportunities resulting from the crisis, but again it's about, now if we take trade and investment for instance, there are several domestic issues that are not related to the war or not related to any other economy. We have so many issues with trade and investment that have to be resolved. We are doing some of it now slowly, but I think we can ramp it up. And if we are serious about it and if we position ourselves serious enough, then I think we can seize the opportunity.
So looking ahead beyond the immediate disruptions, what lessons can we put into place to make sure that we are able to at least weather these future shocks, external shocks that come our way all the time now?
If we consider our situation 4 years ago to now, we are in a much better position to face this global shock than we were before, because we have been prudent with our fiscal policies, because we have enacted certain certain reforms which are strengthening the structural basis of our economy, the foundation. So I think previously we had a weak foundation, and of course with a weak foundation, if you just consider the concept of a house, even with a weak foundation you can't weather a storm, but with a strong foundation you can. So I think the lesson for Sri Lanka is to be resilient. Let's rely on our structural foundations. Let's rely on the strength of our structure rather than being reactionary. So let's be proactive with the reforms even. Let's not delay. Let's try to do as much as we can. Let's try to ramp up whatever reforms, like for instance with state-owned enterprise reform has been very slow. Now we have just very recently implemented trade reforms like the phasing out of para-tariffs. It's going to take over 3 years, but there has to be commitment across the board from political parties to stick to this reform agenda, because we really can't afford to fall back or to reverse these gains, because ultimately that is going to be the foundation we can rely on.
From YouTube to Instagram, Facebook and LinkedIn, Kaleidoscope shines across every feed. Subscribe and follow to get more.
You focus on your goals. We will take care of the risks. Ceylinco Life.